The brisk autumn wind swept through the streets of Midtown Manhattan, carrying with it the sounds of distant sirens and hurried footsteps. Among the morning bustle, a sleek black SUV pulled up outside the towering federal building. Dr. Elise Hayes emerged, her tailored suit and calm demeanor projecting authority. As the newly appointed director of the FBI, Elise represented a milestone, the first African-American woman to hold the position in the Bureau's history. Elise had built her reputation on competence, integrity, and an unrelenting drive to dismantle systemic corruption. But her ascent had made her a target, within and outside the system. To some, her success was a beacon of progress. To others, it was an affront to the status quo. Her schedule that morning was tight, but the community outreach meeting at a local precinct had been deemed a priority. The precinct, notorious for allegations of misconduct and racial profiling, had a history of strained relations with the surrounding community. Elise saw the visit as an opportunity to initiate change. As she entered the precinct's main hall, conversations quieted. Officers glanced up, some nodding politely while others exchanged skeptical looks. Elise's every move seemed to challenge the unspoken hierarchy of the room. Among the officers stood Brent Morrison, tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of self-assured authority. Brent had been with the force for over a decade, his career marred by numerous complaints swept under the rug. To him, Elise was a symbol of everything wrong with what he called the new era, a world where his authority could be questioned, and where someone like her could hold ultimate power over him. Elise approached the group gathered for the meeting, her voice steady and clear. She spoke of accountability, transparency, and the importance of rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the community. Her words struck a chord with some, but Brent stood rigid, his arms crossed, a scowl darkening his face. The tipping point came during the Q&A session. A community leader, a young black man named Malik, posed a pointed question about the lack of repercussions for officers accused of misconduct. "Director Hayes," Malik began, his voice firm, "how do you plan to address officers who think they're above the law? Because it seems like some of them are right here in this room." The room fell silent. Brent's jaw clenched as all eyes turned toward him. He was known for his short temper, and Malik's words, though general, felt like a personal attack. Elise met Malik's gaze, her response measured. "No one is above the law, Malik. Accountability begins with leadership, and I intend to ensure that every complaint is investigated thoroughly, without bias." Her response was met with murmurs of approval, but Brent saw it as an insult, a veiled attack on his record. He glared at Elise, his resentment simmering beneath the surface. The meeting concluded, but Brent's anger didn't dissipate. As Elise walked toward her SUV in the precinct's parking lot, Brent followed, his footsteps heavy. "You think you're better than us?" he called out, his voice sharp and accusatory. Elise stopped, turning to face him. "Excuse me? You come in here grandstanding, making us look like we're the problem. You don't know a damn thing about what it's like on the streets." Elise's expression remained calm, though her eyes narrowed slightly. "Officer Morrison, if you have concerns about today's discussion, I'd be happy to address them in an official setting. But this is neither the time nor the place." Her composed response only fueled Brent's anger. "You're not going to lecture me," he shouted, stepping closer. "You don't belong here. You don't belong in that position." The parking lot grew quiet as a few officers and civilians noticed the altercation. Elise's security team, standing nearby, began to approach cautiously. "Officer Morrison, stand down," Elise said firmly, her voice unwavering. But Brent's temper exploded. He jabbed a finger in her direction before shoving her shoulder hard enough to send her staggering back against the SUV. "You're just a quota hire, and everyone knows it." The sound of the impact and Brent's shouted words echoed through the lot. Cameras clicked, body cams whirred, and phones recorded the scene as officers rushed forward to separate them. Elise straightened, brushing off her jacket, her expression calm despite the tension. "Officer Morrison," she said, her voice cutting through the commotion, "you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." Within minutes, the precinct's captain and federal agents arrived. Brent was restrained, his protests growing louder. "She provoked me! This is a setup!" The captain turned to Elise, his face pale. "Director Hayes, handle this," Elise interrupted, her tone icy. "I expect a full report on my desk by the end of the day." As Brent was led away in handcuffs, his indignation turned to fear. The crowd dispersed, But Elise's presence lingered, her words and actions a stark reminder of her strength and determination. Dr. Elise Hayes had learned long ago that leadership in law enforcement wasn't just about skill or intellect, it was about resilience. As she sat in the back seat of her SUV, her security detail driving her back to FBI headquarters, she replayed the incident with Brent Morrison in her mind. His words weren't surprising. She'd encountered men like him throughout her career. What lingered was the ripple effect of his actions, not just on her, but on the department, the community, and the broader system she was working to reform. Elise's path to the top had been anything but smooth. Born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, she had grown up in a tight-knit community where stories of injustice were a daily reality. Her father, a civil rights lawyer, often reminded her that true change came not from anger, but from persistence. "Fight the system from within," he would say, his words etched into her memory. After law school at Howard University, Elise had joined the FBI, quickly making a name for herself by infiltrating white supremacist groups and dismantling their networks. She was sharp, methodical, and empathetic, a combination that earned her both respect and resentment. Her promotion to FBI director had been historic, but it came with its challenges. The media had been divided. Some hailed her appointment as a win for progress, while others questioned whether she was qualified or just a symbolic hire. Every decision she made, every move she took, was scrutinized through lenses clouded by bias. Back at the precinct, Brent Morrison sat in a holding cell, his fists clenched and his mind racing. He couldn't believe how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. To him, he was the victim, a loyal officer betrayed by a system that was too focused on appeasing politics rather than protecting its own. Brent's upbringing had been a stark contrast to Elise's. Raised in a small town in upstate New York, he grew up in a family that viewed the world through a lens of suspicion. His father, a retired police sergeant, often spoke about the good old days when officers were respected without question. Those stories shaped Brent's worldview, reinforcing his belief in a rigid hierarchy where authority was absolute, and challenges to it were unpatriotic. As a young officer, Brent had been praised for his assertiveness in the field. But as societal expectations shifted and calls for police reform grew louder, he found himself at odds with the changing culture. To Brent, people like Elise Hayes symbolized a world where his authority was no longer unassailable. News of the incident spread quickly. Videos of the confrontation went viral, sparking outrage and reigniting debates about racism and accountability in law enforcement. For many in the Black community, Elise's calm handling of the situation was a source of pride. She was proof that strength didn't have to come from aggression, but from composure and clarity. At the same time, Brent's actions became a rallying cry for extremists who saw him as a martyr. Social media was ablaze with polarized commentary, reflecting the deep divisions in the country. Back at FBI headquarters, Elise met with her trusted inner circle. Among them were Special Agent Maria Torres, her longtime ally, and one of the most respected negotiators in the Bureau, and Deputy Director James Ellison, a seasoned agent who had mentored Elise early in her career. Maria leaned against the conference table, her expression a mix of anger and admiration. "That guy's got a rap sheet full of complaints. How is it that he lasted this long on the force?" "Systemic inertia," Elise replied, her voice steady. "The same thing that's kept too many others like him in power, but this time the system is on notice." James nodded. "The footage is undeniable. The DOJ is already involved. Morrison's career is over, but the precinct will take a hit too. There's going to be backlash." Elise leaned forward, her hands clasped. "Good, let the backlash come. It's long past time for accountability." Later that evening, Elise sat alone in her office, the city lights casting shadows across her desk. She pulled out a framed photo of her parents, their smiles frozen in time. Her mother, a teacher, had always been her biggest cheerleader. "You're going to change the world, Elise," she'd often said. She exhaled deeply, thinking about the sacrifices her parents had made and the weight of their expectations. Moments like today reminded her why she couldn't falter. The fight wasn't just about her. It was about paving the way for others, ensuring that no one else had to endure what she had. Meanwhile, Brent sat in silence, his bravado replaced by fear. He'd been suspended without pay pending an internal investigation, but he knew it was over. The precinct captain, facing mounting pressure, had publicly denounced his actions, and the body cam footage had left no room for doubt. Brent's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from supporters and detractors alike. For the first time, he felt the weight of his choices, not as a badge of pride, but as a chain dragging him down. The fallout from the confrontation between director Elise Hayes and Officer Brent Morrison unfolded rapidly, thrusting both individuals into the national spotlight. While Elise remained focused on her duties, the media frenzy surrounding the incident escalated tensions. What began as a local altercation now threatened to become a flashpoint for deeper societal divides. By the next morning, news outlets were dissecting every detail of the incident. Video clips from the parking lot played on a loop, accompanied by heated debates between commentators. On one side were those who saw Elise as a symbol of professionalism and restraint, a leader who epitomized dignity in the face of hostility. On the other were voices decrying her as part of an agenda to undermine law enforcement, a narrative fueled by fringe groups and certain media personalities. Elise watched one such segment in her office. The host, a fiery conservative pundit, questioned her qualifications, weaving conspiracy theories about her appointment. "She's not there because she's the best," the pundit sneered. "She's there to fill a diversity quota, and now she's coming after hard-working officers like Brent Morrison." Maria Torres walked in mid-broadcast, shutting the TV off with a firm press of the remote. "You shouldn't watch that garbage." Elise leaned back, exhaling. "I need to know what they're saying. Ignoring it won't make it go away." "They're scared of you," Maria said, her tone fierce. "You're everything they didn't think could happen. Competent, unflappable, and unbothered by their noise. That's why they're loud. They're trying to drown out the truth." Elise nodded but remained silent. She understood the stakes. This wasn't just about her. It was about the broader fight against systemic inequities in law enforcement. Meanwhile, Brent Morrison's anger deepened as he sat at home, suspended and awaiting the results of the internal investigation. He was a pariah in his own department, shunned by colleagues who didn't want to be associated with him. Despite his bravado during the incident, he now felt the walls closing in. Messages of support from extremist groups offered some solace, but they also brought an uncomfortable realization. The people championing his cause were not those he had once considered on his side. They weren't his peers. They were agitators who saw him as a pawn in their broader agenda. One evening, as he scrolled through his phone, a notification popped up, an anonymous email linking him to a private forum. Inside were messages urging him to fight back and expose the corruption at the top. Brent, already consumed by a sense of betrayal, found himself drawn to the rhetoric. At FBI headquarters, Elise faced mounting pressures. An inquiry into the precinct's practices had revealed a pattern of unchecked misconduct, with Brent Morrison's record serving as the most glaring example. She had pushed for swift action, recommending federal oversight of the department. Her stance earned her both allies and enemies. Civil rights organizations applauded her decisiveness, while law enforcement unions accused her of scapegoating officers. Elise knew the backlash would come, but the vitriol aimed at her still stung. One particularly aggressive email stood out. "You're ruining this country," it read. "We won't stand by and let you destroy the only thing keeping us safe." Elise forwarded the message to her security detail without a second thought, but Maria noticed the tension in her friend's face. "This isn't new for you," Maria said gently, "but it feels heavier now." "It is heavier," Elise admitted. "This isn't just about a single precinct or officer. It's about challenging a culture that's resisted change for decades. That scares people." As the investigation into Brent continued, a junior officer named Kevin Walker, a young idealistic recruit, came forward with damning evidence. He revealed that Brent had tampered with body cam footage in previous incidents, erasing incriminating moments. The revelation sent shockwaves through the precinct, further isolating Brent. Feeling cornered, he reached out to one of the extremist groups that had contacted him. They proposed a plan: use the media frenzy to stage a public confrontation, turning Brent into a symbol of resistance against what they called the federal overreach, embodied by Elise. Brent, desperate and angry, agreed. The staged confrontation happened during a press conference Elise held at City Hall. She was addressing the nation, outlining a comprehensive plan to reform law enforcement accountability. As she spoke, Brent appeared in the crowd, flanked by a small group of protesters holding signs decrying her as a tyrant. Elise noticed him immediately, But she didn't falter. She continued speaking, her voice steady and unwavering. Brent, however, pushed his way forward, shouting accusations. "You think you're saving this country?" he yelled. "You're tearing it apart." Elise paused, letting the commotion settle before addressing him directly. "Officer Morrison, I understand your frustration," she said calmly. "But accountability isn't destruction. It's the foundation of trust. If you believe otherwise, I invite you to examine why that is." The crowd murmured, and cameras zoomed in on Brent's face. For a moment he hesitated, his anger tempered by the weight of her words. But the extremists behind him urged him on, shouting for him to stand his ground. Security intervened before the situation escalated further, escorting Brent out of the building. But the damage was done. The confrontation, broadcast live, exposed not just Brent's personal vendetta, but the dangerous forces manipulating him. The confrontation at the press conference left a lasting impact, exposing Brent Morrison as both a flawed individual and a pawn in a larger, more insidious movement. But the fallout extended far beyond the immediate players, weaving together a web of personal, professional, and societal conflicts that deepened the story's stakes. Back at FBI headquarters, Elise Hayes faced increasing pressure from both her allies and detractors. Internally, some senior agents expressed concerns that the Bureau's focus on the Brent Morrison case had turned into a media spectacle. One of her staunchest supporters, Deputy Director James Ellison, voiced his unease during a late-night strategy meeting. "Elise," James began cautiously, "I support your vision, but this Morrison thing, it's becoming a distraction. We have real threats to national security. Domestic terrorism is rising, and we need the Bureau's full attention there." Elise met his gaze, her tone firm but measured. "James, Morrison isn't just one bad cop. He's a symptom of a larger issue, one that feeds into the very domestic threats you're worried about. Extremists are emboldened by a lack of accountability in law enforcement. If we don't address that, we're ignoring the root of the problem." James nodded, though his expression remained tense. Elise knew she was walking a tightrope, balancing immediate threats with long overdue systemic reforms. Meanwhile, Brent Morrison spiraled further into despair and defiance. Isolated from his peers and dismissed by the precinct, he found solace only in the echo chambers of online forums. These spaces validated his grievances and painted him as a hero fighting against an oppressive regime. But Brent wasn't entirely convinced of his newfound allies. While they applauded his confrontation with Elise, their rhetoric grew increasingly violent, urging him to take more drastic measures. "You can't let her win," one message read. "Real heroes don't just talk, they act." Brent wrestled with his emotions, torn between his anger at Elise and his growing fear of being used. He began to realize that the people egging him on cared little about him. They were more interested in leveraging his downfall for their own agendas. At the same time, Kevin Walker, the young officer who had exposed Brent's misconduct, faced his own challenges. His decision to come forward made him a target within the precinct, where a culture of loyalty often trumped ethics. Fellow officers ostracized him, and anonymous threats began appearing in his locker. Kevin confided in Elise during a private meeting. "I didn't think it would get this bad," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I just wanted to do the right thing." Elise leaned forward, her expression empathetic but resolute. "Kevin, you did do the right thing, and that's never easy. But change starts with people like you, people willing to stand up when it matters most." Her words gave Kevin a renewed sense of purpose, though the road ahead remained fraught with challenges. The media frenzy surrounding the case continued to grow, drawing attention from lawmakers and civil rights organizations. Elise's efforts to push for federal oversight of the precinct gained traction, with a bipartisan group of senators introducing legislation aimed at increasing accountability in local law enforcement. But not everyone welcomed the changes. Police unions across the country launched a counter-campaign, framing the proposed reforms as an attack on officers' rights. Town hall meetings turned into battlegrounds, with passionate arguments on both sides. In one particularly heated exchange, a black mother stood up, clutching a photo of her son who had been killed in a police shooting. "Accountability isn't about punishing good officers," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's about making sure no other parent has to hold a picture instead of their child." The room fell silent, her words cutting through the noise. Unbeknownst to Elise, A small faction within the precinct had begun conspiring to discredit her. Led by a veteran officer with ties to Brent, they sought to exploit her every move, hoping to cast doubt on her leadership. Their plan involved leaking selective information about the FBI's investigation into the precinct, framing it as overreach, and painting Elise as a power-hungry bureaucrat. They knew that even the appearance of impropriety could undermine her credibility. One evening, Elise received an anonymous tip about the conspiracy. The caller, whose voice was distorted, warned her to tread carefully. "They're not just coming for your position," the voice said. "They're coming for your legacy." Elise immediately ordered an internal investigation, determined to uncover the truth. Amid the chaos, Elise found moments of hope and solidarity. Community leaders rallied behind her, organizing peaceful demonstrations in support of her efforts. Messages of encouragement poured in from individuals inspired by her courage. One letter, handwritten and unsigned, stood out. "Dear Director Hayes, I never thought someone like you could make it to where you are. Seeing you stand tall, even when the world tries to knock you down, gives me hope. Thank you for fighting for all of us." Elise smiled as she read the letter, a reminder that her work was making a difference, even if the road ahead was steep. The tension reached a boiling point 2 weeks after the press conference. The investigation into Brent Morrison and the precinct had uncovered deeper issues than Elise initially anticipated. A whistleblower provided damning evidence of falsified reports, hidden misconduct files, and even direct communications between certain officers and extremist groups. The revelations were explosive, threatening not just the precinct, but the credibility of the entire city's law enforcement system. Elise knew she had to act decisively. She scheduled a press briefing to announce the findings and outline the federal actions that would follow. However, what she didn't know was that her enemies had been working in the shadows to sabotage her efforts. The day before the briefing, a confidential memo from Elise's office was leaked to the press. The memo, taken out of context, appeared to suggest that Elise intended to push for federal oversight of all major police departments in the country, a move some viewed as authoritarian. The backlash was immediate. Law enforcement unions called for her resignation, claiming she was overstepping her authority. Political commentators on both sides of the aisle debated her intentions, with some accusing her of using the FBI to centralize power. Elise's inner circle was in damage control mode. Deputy Director James Ellison and Special Agent Maria Torres convened an emergency meeting to discuss the leak. "This was deliberate," Maria said, slamming the memo onto the table. "Someone's trying to undermine you." James nodded. "We need to get ahead of this. Elise, your statement tomorrow has to be airtight. If we don't control the narrative, they will." Elise sat silently for a moment, her hands steepled under her chin. "The truth is on our side," she said finally. "We stick to the facts. The investigation speaks for itself." Despite her resolve, Elise couldn't ignore the unease settling in her chest. The leak wasn't just an attack on her. It was an attempt to derail the reforms she had fought so hard to implement. As Elise prepared for the briefing, Brent Morrison was making plans of his own. Consumed by bitterness and egged on by his extremist contacts, Brent saw the briefing as an opportunity to strike back. He had convinced himself that Elise's downfall was the only way to restore his reputation and save what he believed was a collapsing system. The extremist group Brent had been communicating with provided him with a detailed plan: infiltrate the briefing disguised as a reporter, and create a public spectacle that would force Elise to resign. Brent hesitated as he read through the instructions. The group's suggestions were far more extreme than he had anticipated, involving acts that could harm innocent people. But his anger clouded his judgment, and he convinced himself that the ends justified the means. The day of the briefing arrived. Elise stood at the podium, flanked by her team and several federal agents. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras trained on her as she began to speak. "Today, I am here to address the findings of the investigation into Precinct 44, she began, her voice calm and authoritative. "What we uncovered is deeply troubling. A pattern of misconduct, falsified reports, and a failure to hold officers accountable. This is not just a failure of leadership, it is a betrayal of the public trust." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from some and visible discomfort from others. Elise continued, outlining the federal actions to follow, including a full overhaul of the precinct's leadership and mandatory training programs to address implicit bias. In the back of the room, Brent sat quietly, his disguise rendering him almost unrecognizable. He clutched a small recording device in one hand, his heart pounding as he waited for the right moment to act. When Elise opened the floor for questions, Brent seized his opportunity. He stood, his voice loud and accusatory. "Director Hayes, how can the public trust you when you've made it clear that your goal is to destroy local law enforcement? Isn't this about consolidating power for yourself?" The room erupted in whispers as cameras swiveled toward Brent. Elise remained composed, her gaze steady as she addressed him. "The goal here is not destruction, but accountability. Those who serve the public must also answer to the public." Brent wasn't satisfied. "You're targeting good officers while ignoring real criminals. You've turned this into a witch hunt." Before Elise could respond, Brent reached into his pocket, pulling out a small object. Panic rippled through the room as security moved swiftly to intercept him. In the chaos that followed, Brent's true intentions were revealed. The object he carried wasn't a weapon, but a recording device he intended to use to capture and manipulate Elise's words. However, the extremist group he had allied with had tampered with his plans, leaving him unknowingly carrying evidence that linked him to their broader activities. As federal agents detained him, Brent's protests grew desperate. "This isn't what it looks like. They set me up." Elise watched the scene unfold with a mix of relief and sadness. Brent was no longer just a disgraced officer. He had become a cautionary tale of how hatred and manipulation could destroy a person. The incident at the briefing became a turning point in the national conversation about law enforcement and accountability. The evidence found on Brent's device exposed the extremist group's involvement, shifting public focus from Elise's reforms to the dangerous undercurrents threatening the nation's security. Elise's steady leadership during the crisis solidified her position, earning her respect even among some of her critics. But the events left her more determined than ever to address the systemic issues that had allowed individuals like Brent to thrive. The aftermath of the press briefing reverberated across the nation. The incident, captured live and dissected by media outlets, shifted the focus from Elise Hayes' reforms to the broader threats of extremism and systemic corruption. While Elise had maintained her composure throughout the ordeal, the consequences were far-reaching, reshaping public perception, alliances, and the stakes of her mission. Brent Morrison's arrest marked the final collapse of his once proud career. The recording device he carried revealed damning connections between him and the extremist group that had exploited his resentment. Emails and text messages painted a picture of a man driven by anger and desperation, manipulated into becoming a pawn for dangerous ideologies. In court, Brent's defense centered on his claim that he had been used and misled. "I didn't know what they were planning," he argued during his arraignment. "I just wanted to expose the truth about Hayes." The prosecutor, however, dismantled his arguments with ease. "You weren't exposing truth," she retorted. "You were weaponizing lies. And in doing so, you endangered not only Director Hayes, but the integrity of the entire justice system." Brent's conviction was swift, and his sentencing became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked prejudice and the seductive pull of extremism. The revelations about the extremist group's involvement shocked the public, shifting the narrative around Elise Hayes. The same commentators who had previously criticized her now praised her unshakable demeanor and the reforms she championed. "She faced hate, sabotage, and danger," one prominent journalist wrote, "and she didn't flinch. Director Hayes is the kind of leader this country needs." Elise's supporters rallied around her, organizing peaceful demonstrations and online campaigns to counter the vitriol that still lingered in some corners of society. Community leaders praised her as a symbol of resilience and progress, while civil rights groups highlighted her reforms as a blueprint for nationwide change. But Elise was cautious about celebrating. "This is a step forward," she told Maria Torres during a late-night debrief. "But it's just one step. There's still so much to do." For Kevin Walker, the young officer who had exposed Brent's earlier misconduct, the fallout was both validating and sobering. The investigation into the precinct revealed systemic issues far beyond Brent, and Kevin's testimony became a cornerstone of the federal case against the department's leadership. Though he faced backlash from some colleagues, Kevin also received an outpouring of support from others who admired his courage. Elise personally commended him during a private meeting at FBI headquarters. "You've set an example," she told him. "Your actions remind us that integrity is about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." Kevin's journey wasn't without its challenges. His relationships within the precinct remained strained, but he found strength in the knowledge that he had been a catalyst for change. Despite her public composure, Elise couldn't ignore the personal toll of the events. Late one evening, she sat in her office, staring at the city lights beyond her window. The weight of her position, the sacrifices it demanded, and the hostility it attracted, pressed heavily on her shoulders. Maria found her there, a cup of coffee in hand. "You've been at it all day," she said, placing the cup on Elise's desk. Elise smiled faintly. "Days like this make me wonder if it's worth it." Maria leaned against the desk, her tone firm. "It's worth it, Elise. Because of you, people like Morrison can't hide behind their badges anymore. Because of you, people like Kevin have the courage to speak up. That's worth everything." Elise nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. "It's a long fight, though." Maria chuckled. "Yeah, but if anyone can fight it, it's you." The FBI's investigation into the precinct culminated in sweeping changes. Several senior officers were dismissed, and new leadership was installed with a mandate to rebuild trust with the community. Federal oversight became a contentious but necessary measure, ensuring that reforms weren't just promises, but actions. Elise's reforms gained traction beyond the city, inspiring similar efforts in other jurisdictions. Lawmakers began drafting legislation to address systemic issues in law enforcement, guided by the principles Elise had championed. However, opposition persisted. Some officers resisted the changes, framing them as attacks on their autonomy. Elise knew that the battle for accountability was far from over, but she also knew that the momentum was on her side. Amid the challenges, Elise found moments of hope. She received letters from young women inspired by her leadership, parents who saw her as a role model for their daughters, and activists who viewed her as a beacon of progress. One letter stood out. "Dear Director Hayes, because of you, I believe I can make a difference. Thank you for showing us what courage looks like." Elise folded the letter carefully, placing it in her desk drawer. It was a reminder that the fight wasn't just about policies or institutions. It was about people, and the belief that change, however slow, was possible. Dr. Elise Hayes knew the road ahead wasn't getting any easier. Despite the progress made in exposing corruption and implementing reforms, the resistance from entrenched forces remained fierce. She had learned to thrive under pressure, but the stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about her career. It was about a movement that aimed to transform law enforcement and restore trust to a broken system. The public fallout from the Brent Morrison incident had made her a household name. While supporters saw her as a trailblazer, critics painted her as an overreaching bureaucrat. Elise understood that the scrutiny was inevitable, but the personal toll was harder to ignore. Just as the dust began to settle, a new threat emerged. Anonymous online forums and extremist groups targeted Elise with renewed intensity, spreading disinformation designed to undermine her credibility. One rumor claimed she had fabricated evidence in the investigation against Brent, a baseless accusation that gained traction in conspiracy circles. Maria Torres was the first to bring the matter to Elise's attention. "It's nonsense," Maria said, tossing a printout of a viral post onto Elise's desk. "But it's spreading fast. If we don't address it, it'll stick." Elise picked up the printout, her expression calm but thoughtful. "Addressing it gives it legitimacy," she said, "but ignoring it lets them control the narrative." Deputy Director James Ellison entered the room, his usual calm demeanor replaced by urgency. "The DOJ wants us to respond. The Attorney General is worried this could spiral into something bigger." Elise considered her options, weighing the risks. "We'll issue a statement," she decided. "Clear, concise, and backed by facts. But we won't get drawn into their game. The work we're doing speaks for itself." That evening, Elise took a rare moment for herself. Sitting on the balcony of her apartment, she gazed at the city skyline, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She thought of her parents who had instilled in her the values of integrity and perseverance, and of the countless individuals who had reached out to thank her for her efforts. The weight of leadership felt heavier than ever, but so did her sense of purpose. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Kevin Walker. "Director Hayes, I just wanted to thank you again. I wouldn't have come forward without your example. You remind us all what it means to lead." Elise smiled, a glimmer of hope piercing through the weight of the day. Meanwhile, tensions within the FBI simmered. While Elise's reforms were embraced by many, others resisted the changes. Senior agents accustomed to the old ways viewed her initiatives as unnecessary or overly critical of law enforcement. During a staff meeting, one senior agent voiced his concerns. "Director Hayes, I understand the need for accountability, but these reforms are creating distrust among our agents. Morale is low." Elise's gaze was steady as she replied, "Morale is low because we're asking people to confront uncomfortable truths. But discomfort is necessary for growth. If we want to rebuild trust with the public, we must first hold ourselves to the highest standards." Her words silenced the room, but she knew the resistance wouldn't vanish overnight. Despite the challenges, Elise began to see cracks in the wall of opposition. A small but growing number of law enforcement leaders reached out, expressing interest in adopting similar reforms in their departments. One such leader was Chief Daniel Porter, who led a precinct in Chicago. During a video conference, he praised Elise's work. "I'll be honest," he admitted. "I wasn't sure about you at first, but seeing what you've done, I'm convinced. We need to follow your example." The conversation buoyed Elise, reinforcing her belief that change, while slow, was possible. The next major milestone was a Senate hearing where Elise would testify about the FBI's findings and propose a federal initiative to expand oversight and accountability in law enforcement. The hearing was a critical moment, one that could solidify the reforms she championed or dismantle them under political pressure. Elise's preparation was meticulous. She worked late into the night with Maria and James, crafting a statement that was both factual and compelling. They anticipated tough questions from senators aligned with law enforcement unions, as well as those influenced by the extremist rhetoric that had taken root in parts of the country. "Stay focused on the data," James advised, "but don't lose the human element. People need to feel why this matters." Maria nodded. "And don't let them bait you. They'll try to make this about you, not the reforms. Keep steering it back to the bigger picture." Elise listened intently, internalizing their advice. She knew the hearing would be a battle, but she was ready. The night before the hearing, Elise received an unexpected call from Senator Grace Whitman, a conservative lawmaker known for her staunch support of law enforcement. "Director Hayes," the senator began, "I've reviewed your findings. I don't agree with everything you've proposed, but I can't deny the evidence you've presented. I'm willing to support some of your initiatives. On one condition." Elise's curiosity was piqued. "And what's that, Senator?" "Transparency," Whitman replied. "The public needs to see every step of this process. No closed-door meetings, no hidden agendas. If you can guarantee that, I'll back you." Elise agreed, recognizing the strategic importance of Whitman's support. It was an unexpected but welcome boost as she headed into the most critical moment of her career. The Senate hearing room was packed. Cameras lined the walls, capturing every moment as lawmakers, journalists, and public figures filled the seats. Dr. Elise Hayes, wearing her trademark composed expression, sat at the witness table. In front of her were binders of meticulously compiled evidence, documents, reports, and testimonies that painted a clear picture of systemic issues within law enforcement. This was the culmination of weeks of investigations, public scrutiny, and personal challenges. Elise knew the stakes. Her testimony would determine whether her proposed reforms gained the legislative support needed to become law or were dismissed under political pressure. The chairperson, Senator Rebecca Stone, opened the hearing with a sharp tone. "Today's hearing will address the findings of the FBI's investigation into Precinct 44 and the broader implications for law enforcement reform nationwide. Director Hayes, you may proceed with your statement." Elise rose, her voice steady but firm. "Madam Chair, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. What I present to you is not speculation, but fact. The investigation into Precinct 44 revealed a culture of misconduct that eroded public trust and compromised justice. This is not an isolated incident. It is a systemic issue, one that demands immediate and comprehensive reform." She outlined the key findings. falsified reports, excessive force incidents ignored or covered up, and ties between certain officers and extremist groups. Her words carried weight, each statement supported by evidence. The room was silent, the gravity of her testimony sinking in. As Elise concluded her statement, the questioning began. Senator Grace Whitman, her newly acquired ally, started with measured inquiries, allowing Elise to emphasize the necessity and scope of the proposed reforms. Director Hayes, Whitman said, her voice calm but firm, your findings are deeply concerning. How do you propose we ensure these issues are addressed without undermining the morale and effectiveness of law enforcement? Elise responded with precision. Senator, accountability and effectiveness are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they reinforce each other. A system that holds officers to high standards builds trust, which is the foundation of effective policing. Her answer drew nods from several committee members, but not everyone was convinced. Senator Mark Callaway, a vocal opponent of Elise's reforms, leaned forward, his expression skeptical. Director Hayes, you've made strong accusations, but some would say your proposals are extreme, bordering on federal overreach. How do you respond to those concerns? Elise met his gaze without flinching. Senator Callaway, ensuring accountability is not overreach. It is our duty. The alternative is a system where misconduct thrives unchecked, and the public loses faith in those sworn to protect them. This isn't about power. It's about responsibility. Callaway smirked, attempting to pivot. And what do you say to the accusations that you've weaponized your position to push a personal agenda? Elise's voice remained steady. My agenda, Senator, is justice. If ensuring accountability is controversial, then perhaps the controversy lies not with my actions, but with the resistance to change. Just as the hearing seemed to be following a predictable path, a bombshell was dropped. A whistleblower, a former precinct officer, stepped forward, having been anonymously invited to testify. The officer, visibly nervous, recounted instances of direct orders to cover up misconduct. I was told to delete body cam footage, the officer said, their voice shaking. I was threatened when I refused. Director Hayes' investigation is the only reason I'm here today. Without her leadership, this would have stayed buried. The room erupted into whispers. Elise sat silently, allowing the weight of the whistleblower's words to sink in. This unexpected testimony validated her findings and shifted the narrative further in her favor. Toward the end of the hearing, Senator Stone addressed Elise directly. Director Hayes, you've outlined a compelling case. But the question remains, how do we reconcile the need for reform with the reality that some officers feel vilified by these efforts? Elise paused, choosing her words carefully. Madam Chair, the purpose of these reforms is not to vilify but to uplift. The vast majority of officers serve with honor and integrity. These measures are about ensuring that their efforts are not undermined by the actions of a few. Accountability protects the integrity of the badge. Her words struck a chord, eliciting nods from several senators, including Whitman. As the hearing drew to a close, a commotion erupted outside the room. Protesters had gathered, some supporting Elise, others opposing her. Among the crowd, members of the extremist group tied to Brent Morrison attempted to disrupt the proceedings, chanting slogans and holding inflammatory signs. Security quickly intervened, but the disruption underscored the stakes of the moment. Elise remained composed, even as the noise outside grew louder. Director Hayes, Senator Stone said, her voice cutting through the din, thank you for your testimony. This committee will reconvene to deliberate on your proposals. Elise nodded, standing tall as the hearing adjourned. Outside the Capitol, Elise addressed reporters, her voice calm but resolute. Today's hearing was a step toward justice. Reform is not easy, but it is necessary. We owe it to the public, and to the countless officers who serve honorably, to build a system that reflects the values we all hold dear. Her words echoed across the nation, solidifying her role as a leader, unafraid to confront the toughest challenges. The weeks following the Senate hearing marked a turning point for both Elise Hayes and the broader movement she represented. The testimony, evidence, and unexpected whistleblower revelations left an indelible mark on the national consciousness. The committee's deliberations culminated in a landmark decision, a bipartisan agreement to implement federal oversight and accountability measures for law enforcement nationwide. The passage of the reforms was met with a wave of reactions. In cities across the country, community leaders celebrated the long overdue changes. Peaceful demonstrations took place, with signs bearing slogans like "Justice for All" and "Accountability equals trust." Media coverage shifted from skepticism to admiration for Elise's perseverance. Editorials lauded her as a transformational figure, someone who stood firm in the face of hostility and proved that change was possible. Director Hayes didn't just survive the storm, one prominent journalist wrote. She reshaped it, turning resistance into reform. But the backlash, though diminished, had not disappeared. Law enforcement unions continued to voice opposition, with some departments slow to implement the new policies. Elise knew that legislation was only the first step. True reform would require ongoing vigilance and cultural change. One evening, Elise returned to her childhood home in Atlanta for the first time in years. The familiar creak of the front porch and the scent of magnolias in the yard brought a wave of nostalgia. Sitting in her father's old chair, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Fight the system from within. She had done just that, but the fight was far from over. Her phone buzzed with a message from Maria Torres. "We've got momentum, Elise. Don't stop now." Elise smiled, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the fire of determination. Brent Morrison, now serving a prison sentence for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, became a cautionary tale. His story was dissected in think pieces and documentaries, a stark reminder of how unchecked prejudice and bitterness could lead to self-destruction. For his part, Brent spent his days in reflection, far removed from the extremist voices that had once fueled him. Though publicly defiant during his trial, in private he began to reckon with the choices that had led him to this point. At FBI headquarters, Elise stood before a room of newly recruited agents. Her presence commanded respect, her words carrying the weight of her journey. "You are the future of this bureau," she told them. "You have the power to rebuild trust and redefine what it means to serve. This badge is a symbol, not of authority, but of responsibility. Wear it with integrity." The recruits rose to applaud, their admiration evident. Elise saw in their faces a glimmer of hope for the future, a future she had fought tirelessly to shape. As Elise walked through the corridors of the FBI building, she paused to look at a display of the agency's history. Among the photos and plaques, she spotted an empty space, reserved for leaders who had made a lasting impact. She allowed herself a rare moment of pride. The battle wasn't over, but progress had been made. For the first time in months, she felt the faintest sense of peace, not because the work was done, but because it was finally moving forward. Months had passed since the Senate hearing, and the reforms Elise Hayes championed were beginning to take root across the nation. Standing on the steps of the FBI headquarters, Elise gazed out at the city she served, the wind carrying the distant hum of activity. Her phone buzzed. A message from Kevin Walker. "Director Hayes, precinct morale is up. Feels like we're finally moving forward. Thank you." Elise smiled, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. She knew the fight for justice was never ending, but for the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. "One step at a time," she whispered. The journey of Elise Hayes serves as a powerful reminder that real change requires both courage and persistence. Her story is one of resilience, standing firm against a tide of resistance to demand accountability and integrity in systems that impact us all. She demonstrated that leadership is not about power but responsibility, a commitment to ensuring justice for every person, no matter their background. But her story is not just fiction. It reflects struggles faced in the real world every day. Injustice, systemic prejudice, and resistance to reform are not abstract issues. They affect lives, communities, and the very fabric of our society. The call to action is clear. We all have a role to play, whether by educating ourselves, holding institutions accountable, or fostering open conversations. Each of us can contribute to a better, fairer world. Small actions, like voting for reforms, supporting those who stand for justice, or simply listening to marginalized voices, can have a profound impact. Share this story and its lessons with others. Reflect on how you can make a difference in your community or workplace. Change doesn't happen overnight, but together, step by step, we can create a society where justice truly prevails.